what they've found. And as you say, people who couldn't.
But I'm going to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on here. In this area, it's the Yagara and Turrbal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to mention that because we're in Zoom, we are zooming out onto the lands of many traditional owners across the country. And I'd like to pay my respect to their elders wherever you guys may be and whatever land you might be on, and to say that sovereignty was never ceded. This was and always will be Aboriginal land. Now, on that note, I'm very, very excited to introduce you to our guests tonight. This is a bit of a book of the moment. This is a book that has got all of our staff very excited because it's a wonderful piece of work, and we do get a bit of a flutter when we get to read a book of this quality, and when we get to actually meet the author, the flutter is even bigger. But of course, we also have a bit of a flutter to be inviting the wonderful Robert Forster to do the conversation tonight. Robert is a musician and writer, and of course he co-founded the Go-Betweens, and he now has a very successful solo career. Robert's also an award-winning writer. He was the music critic for The Monthly for many years, and he is the author of The 10 Rules of Rock and Roll and the memoir Grant and I. In 2015, the University of Queensland awarded him an honorary Doctorate of Letters, which is exactly how I would like to get mine. Thank you very much. He is the only person that I know who has a bridge named after his band. So everybody, welcome to Robert. And Robert will be, of course, in conversation with the amazing Andrew O'Hagan, who is one of his generation's most exciting and most serious chroniclers of contemporary Britain. He has twice been nominated for the Man Booker Prize and was voted one of Granta's best of young British novelists. He has also won the Los Angeles Times Book Award and the E.M. Forster Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He lives and is zooming in from London as we speak, so it is morning there. So good morning to Andrew, and hello and good evening to Robert. I'll hand over to you, Robert.
Thank you. Thank you, Chrissy. Andrew, my first question is, can you basically explain the outline and shape of the book, so for all, like the questions that are going to follow, people know the world that we're in?
Yes, of course. It's good to be talking to you, Robert. This book, Mayflies, is, if you like, an attempt to offer a story. It's both a joyous and a sad story about a friendship between two young men from Scotland. In the first half of the book, we see them in 1986. We meet them as them and their friends are trying to get to a festival in Manchester, which actually happened in 1986. It was called the Festival of the 10th Summer. It's the 10th anniversary of punk rock. And these boys from the west coast of Scotland in Ayrshire, where I grew up, we see them, as it were, between the ages of 18 and 20, right at the height of their exuberance and all their optimism. The future's in front of them. And we follow them right through that weekend in Manchester as they go and see the bands that they loved. And both the night before the big festival and the day of the festival itself, they're seeing the Smiths, The Fall, Magazine, all these groups that we loved growing up and that they have defined themselves by loving, I would say. Then the book stops and we pick up 30 years later when one of the two boys at the centre of it, Tully Dawson, is facing some terrible news. He has terminal cancer. And the book then becomes about the last year of his life, but also always it's a book about friendship and the price of loyalty, and if you like, the responsibilities of true friendship. So in a sense, it's a sort of platonic romance. It's a book about life and death.
Wow, okay, that's a great description of the book. And why did you decide to write the book now? Like at your time of life, why go back to 1986? Why choose now to tell the story?
I think there's a number of reasons, Robert. I mean, you understand them. I mean, you were very much part of that same world as those boys, and indeed me. In fact, I know we're not in the same room precisely, but the last time we were in the same room, as it were, was when you were on stage with the Go-Betweens at Rooftops in Glasgow, and then again, the International in Manchester. We were serial stalkers of the Go-Betweens, I have to tell you. And in fact, one of the venues that features in this novel, the International, was a place where I saw you play. And I think that the reason, to answer your question, the reason why now was twofold, really. The first stimulus was that this is a purely autobiographical book. That's something that I can say directly and unashamedly. This book was suggested by actuality in my own life, that I was part of a group of boys who I still love and I'm still in contact with. And one of them, a leading figure in that group, a man called Keith Martin, who was a great friend to all of us, he was part of that contingent who, diving into the future, back then in Scotland in the 80s, front man in a band, absolute enthusiast, the best record collection in Europe, the highest cheekbones in Scotland, that guy.
Yeah.
He contacted me a few years ago to say that, and our friendship had continued, of course, through the decades, but that he had cancer. And that last year of his life was one that we all lived through together, and it ended with his death. And just before he died, he said, please write about us. It will make it last. It means that something will remain. And so that was stimulus enough for me. But there was something else, which is that I think that for decades, we're not sure if our childhood was part of a generation. I mean, it's easy to think of your parents' lives as a generation. Here in the UK, the post-war generation, that our fathers met their friends and their male friends doing national service in the military, as it were. And our children, my daughter's 16, they meet friends and pursue their enthusiasms on the internet. But there was a middle generation, ours, where you met people at gigs and in record shops. And, there was no such thing as a chat room. We spent more time at bus stops and in youth clubs. And Britain was a place full of people physically whistling under each other's windows to get their attention. We hardly even used a telephone if we had them. We grew up in a very working class place. Not everybody had telephones even. So it began to look like a generation, the Thatcher generation. We were teenagers during the 80s. We were politicized by the reality of the times. And I felt that it hadn't yet had its novels. At least not the novels that I felt I might contribute. And Mayflies came right out of that, both a very personal place with the death of my friend and a more public place, if you like, with this sense that the generation had come to fruition in the memory and perhaps now in the literature.
Mm-hmm. And so the real trigger of the book is in fact the passing of this friend, you could say recently, because would that be true?
Oh yes, I mean that was the trigger. I mean there's no doubt about it. He and I often spoke. He was a great reader, a fantastic fan, and like Tully in the book, he goes from being a lathe turner in a factory punching metal all day when he's a teenager to being a really inspiring English teacher later in life. I mean, they have an effect on each other's lives, these boys, and that's one of the things I wanted to animate, was how friendship is actually a special place in the heart, as you know, with Grant and the book that you wrote. It's not, it doesn't get the headlines that romantic love does. It doesn't get the Oscars or the song lyrics, perhaps.
Yeah.
But it is it's another deep place in the heart. And so I just hadn't read the books I wanted to read about friendship, really. There's classics, of course. There's Huckleberry Finn, or there's On the Road, about male friendship. But set in the world that I knew and fused by the music we love. This has got the best soundtrack in history. I mean, you're in it too. And that is something I just wanted, for once and for all, with the inspiration of this dear friend and his passing, to do. I actually stopped this epic book that I've been working on for 6 years, a huge Dickensian book about London. I stopped, put it aside, and wrote Mayflies because it was so urgent to me, the sense that it should be done now.
The urgency comes through, I must say, like in the prose and the swiftness of the story. I mean, I found it a book that I read really quickly and really enjoyed, and so I can understand that. I mean, when you're talking about this friendship and this need for a book for this generation, this 1980s, you know, like where they are in the first chapter, this indie rock world is, but you're talking about, you've talked a lot about friendship, and when I was reading the book, I started to, and it's weird because when I started to think about, you know, this narrator who's in the middle of this friendship, this circle, and there's this charismatic leader of the circle, and you're chronicling the words and the attitudes and the life of that charismatic person. It reminded me of forms like The Great Gatsby or On the Road, where it's these books were also you know, like playing on that dynamic between a chronicler who's like in the scene, but also looking at this charismatic person and trying to work them out and live with them, and, you know, half in love with them. And so were these sort of books like examples for you? And are there others that you could suggest?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you've hit on the right ones immediately. In fact, Keith Martin, the friend who inspired the book, I once said to him, you know, quite close to the end for him, we were laughing about things and listening to music, and I said, what do you want the book to be like? And he said, I want it to be like The Great Gatsby with better tunes. So that was a very direct instruction. You know, if he was a director, that would be called a sound note. And of course, he knew me well enough to know that that's exactly what I would want to do myself. And, you know, it's very unusual, Robert. It hardly ever happens. I mean, I don't know if you would agree, but that a book comes to you fully formed.
Yeah.
You have to fight for every sentence and every paragraph. Fiction and non-fiction, both of which I've always written professionally. You know, I'm interested in both, and none of it comes easy. I mean, it's difficult every time. And I think if you're trying to write well, I mean, you try and write a postcard well, it's just not in you. In a musical context, I mean, if you write songs, you're not going to sort of, as it were, lazily accept yourself on a day when you're writing a bad song and think, oh, well, that's all I've got. You're always going to push further. And for me, the difference with this book is that it arrived in my head fully formed. What I had to do was sort of almost transcribe it from my imagination and memory too. Memory and imagination working together in a very surprising way for me. None of my novels had quite worked like that before. So that position of almost just sort of conveying it as clearly and as beautifully as I could, given that it seemed to pre-exist, this book. Mayflies almost came like a perfect form in my head. And when I sat down, I wasn't reaching for this remoteness. Sometimes out of a book, it was just there.
And has that taught you anything? Do you think now, well, I've got to write more like this?
Well, I think that every book you write becomes an element in your autobiography, as it were. I remember Nabokov saying the only biography of a writer that matters is the story of his work or her work. And I think it is a bit like each volume is a stepping stone across a wide river, you know, and you just couldn't get to the next book without that step.
Yeah.
And Mayflies for me is a sort of probably a career-changing book in that it's put me in touch with much more comedy, for example, and a kind of fusion of experience and politics that hadn't quite, I mean, it had certainly been thematically there in previous books and had gone in a different way, perhaps in Our Fathers or Be Near Me, books of mine which, you know, had their own character and were political, but this one has a kind of joy in it, I think, it's fair to say. It's not for me to assess its qualities, obviously, but even I quite enjoyed writing it. That's unusual. You know, looking again at that, listening to the music again and going back and realizing how formed we were by the careers of some of those bands. You know, those individuals, we deeply invested in every single and every album, a group like the Smiths or Joy Division or New Order or Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds or the Go-Betweens. I mean, we grew from single and album to single and album. It defined, I suppose, the journey of our lives, just in the way that I've just described, perhaps one's novels become stepping stones across a river. So did those albums.
Yeah.
You know, we always had a very canonical sense of the importance of the bands. And of course, as you'll remember, it had nothing to do with, as it were, their commercial success. In fact, commercially successful bands were quite suspect to my generation.
Totally, yeah.
You know, it was John Peel, in a sense, was a kind of godfather to us because he helped define not just our taste, as it were, but our values.
Yeah.
And those bands sold us interior values, you know, song after song. We felt we understood community, love, nostalgia, the future, estrangement, any number of things from those albums. We could talk about music the way I think previous generations talked about the Victorian novel, you know, that it brought values into your life, and we shared them. And I wanted this book to carry all that.
It definitely comes through, like in the first half of the book, which is set in Glasgow in 1986. It comes through the dialogue, which is very quick and very swift, and full of, you know, references to these records and films and books.
Yeah.
And it made me think that the 80s indie scene, which is basically the first half of the book, which it, you know, it's just flooded it. And for these six Glasgow, you know, like for these six Scottish working class boys, was that the indie scene, and it really sort of started in the late 70s with, you know, like people like Howard Devoto or Tom Verlaine being in groups, and then it goes into you know, The Fall being named after a book by Camus, and it goes into, you know, it tumbles into the 80s past Orange Juice and into Morrissey, and this time and like post-punk and indie rock was quite literary and throwing out many clues, and like musicians at that time were talking about, you know, they were talking about bands that they love, like the Velvet Underground or Can or the Byrds or whatever, but at the same time they'd be talking about, you know, William Burroughs or Ballard, or, you know, writers like this, and all of that was going out through the music press to the exact, and through the music, of course, to these type of people. So it was like an education of a kind coming through the music.
It really was. I mean, and it's, I think one of the things that's happened in the 3 decades since, if you like, is that it's become a permanence. It's become, as I said before, canonical in the way that, you know, we keep libraries of books in our sitting room so that we can reach up. You could reach over now behind you and pull out something that had mattered to you or mattered to your children or your loved ones, and look at it again. And there was always this notion in the past, I think, that records were more ephemeral, that you listened to them at a stage in your life and then it was over. But I think that part of the reckoning, if you like, of time passing and people dying and things going from your life, is you suddenly realize that not just the songs themselves, but as it were, all the values that they expressed are a permanence. You know, I don't really believe in nostalgia, Robert, to tell you the truth. When people say, oh, it must be nostalgic for you to go back and look at all this, I'm not going back anywhere. I'm going in, not back. And it's that journey in that there is no such thing as the past, really. It's just a sort of augmentation of the present, in my view. And I think that's one of the things the novel tries to embody, a presentness. Just as this man's dying, we suddenly see the past is never gone. It's never gone away. We're looking at the world through the same eyes, really. We've changed, we've grown, we're grey now. You know, we have different relationships, hither and yon, but still there is a kind of eternal truth about our experience that we shared. And some of it is embodied in that music, that the music is ringing out in us still.
Yeah, beautifully put. I wanted to, and all of the, see, that's the amazing thing, because you've got these boys on this, you know, like around council estates. They've got no money, they're in pubs, but they're talking. Their conversation is all pop culture, all pop reference, and it goes at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And as you say, it comes from very much from the music of that time, which had a particular feel and content to it. But I'm just on a and this question is related to that, is that what I really, one of the many things I really admired in the book is that you've got these boys in the first half of the book. And we should say to people that the book is in 2 parts. One is called Summer 1986, and and the other second half of the novel is autumn 2017. So the book is almost split right down the middle. So there's
Yeah.
large sections. And just to talk about that first section is that there's, you know, like you've got 6 characters, they're very talky, they're on drugs, they're drinking alcohol, it's very, very chatty. And how as a writer, I was marveling, how do you do that? How do you sustain over 150 pages, clearly defined characters talking to each other all the time and doing it so beautifully?
I think that's one of the things that certain kinds of novelists share with perhaps actors, playwrights, you know, that sense that you've really got to not only invent these characters, but you've got to inhabit them simultaneously. And so you're there at the desk for those years that you're writing the book, really, as T.S. Eliot said, doing the police in different voices, or Dickens said actually first, and he quoted him saying, you're doing these voices almost as if there's a play in which you're playing all the parts.
Yep.
And I could actually distinctly hear the voices of each of those characters,
Yep.
Women as well, their parents too, you know, different generations and different genders. I mean, that's your job in a way, if you're writing that sort of novel, is to give equal and weight and depth to each of the characters, give them a hinterland. I mean, I would sit for sometimes weeks just trying to work on those dialogue exchanges to make sure the rhythm was right. And that the boys, I mean, young boys don't speak in complete sentences. You've got to work out how to, you know, cut in and under each other. And there's a kind of musicality to that. The compositional nature of it is you've got to adhere to what is plausible and true, and also comical and, if you like, dramatic. But it's got to be that each character has their own nature.
Yep, yep.
Of course, I was helped in this by a memory of certain individuals. I was able to, as it were, graft onto these characters strong memory of the individual boys I ran around with. I mean, when we went to gigs together, the chat was like that all the way.
Yeah.
Vulgar and camp and loud and sort of undercutting and slagging off and endless sort of, you know, sending yourself and each other up. And the cultural references would flood in from kitchen sink dramas and sort of Scorsese movies and The Godfather, and then, you know, attitudes towards music and the music of the past. You mentioned the Velvet Underground and the Birds. I mean, all that was flooding in too. And we never had an empty space when we were together. Somebody was always diving in.
Yeah.
And my job was to get that onto the page. You know, there is a lot of drink, there's a little bit of drugs, but not much. Actually, they didn't have money. So they were just sort of basically sort of, you know, guzzling beer and, you know, chatting. And it was all about the chat. And I think that, especially if you come from a culture, as I do, with a very strong kind of working class oral culture, you know, you go into a pub in Glasgow and the chat is just kind of ceaseless.
Yeah.
And it's really vernacular, it's local, and there's words being used and comedy being outed that could only happen there, if you know. It's truly kind of indigenous in that way.
Yeah.
And I wanted to pour all that into the book so that it's not just, these are not just any boys. They've got to be from that town in that year with those bands in their heads. It can't just be anywhere. But I think what you do with a novel is if you make it particular enough and the comedy and the grief is true, then it becomes universal. So people could be sitting in the outback and reading this novel, and I think they would see something of their own experience in it.
Look, I only want to stay on this for a second because I want to go on to something else that's related to that. But you said something at the start there that I just want to go back to, and it's like a novelist it's about hearing voices, and so you think that's can you tease that a little bit? Like to me, that's a really central thing of what a novelist, I'd imagine, is doing. Can you explain that, hearing voices and getting it on the page?
I think it's something that people sometimes don't expect of the novel, but they do expect it, say, of a poet, or they expect it of a songwriter. I'm sure you've been in that position where you suddenly find yourself writing a song that isn't very precisely in your voice. It's an imagining from another place. I mean, some of the great rock and roll songs are, as it were, you know, dramatizations of a voice that's not the songwriter's. And poets do that all the time. The I in the poem isn't necessarily the writer. You know, you could be, you know, you could write a song that's really in the voice of a sort of, you know, 16th century courtesan, and it just happens to be a piece of storytelling that you're in a position to make. That's true of novelists all the time. I mean, this is written in the first person, so there's a lot of I. James, who narrates the book, is very close to me in age and experience, so it flows from me. But there are times when he has visions of the world and experiences which are really nothing to do with me. I had to invent that for him. And that kind of discussion, if you like, between invented character and reality is really what a lot of contemporary novels are all about. People used to just take it for granted. If you're reading David Copperfield, everybody knows it's very close to Charles Dickens's own childhood, and that the relationships in that book are very like relationships he had. But it's so wound into sort of myth now that it almost doesn't matter. We forget. You know, the same as Jack Kerouac's great On the Road. Well, of course, he crisscrossed America with Neil Cassidy and, you know, took the drugs, smoked the cigarettes, you know, had the relationships, had the visions, the great visions across the American night. And there they are in his book. It almost hardly matters once the book is written because it has its own internal truths. A book is only true to itself. It doesn't matter in the end any more, I think, than a great song does. Does it matter that the person's about somebody you loved, and autobiographically, do we need to know that? I think ultimately great love songs become so universal and mythic that it would hardly matter that the songwriter's really writing about their sweetheart from years ago that nobody's ever met.
A question. I want to get on to the second half of the book as well, but something struck me, and I don't know if this is true. So you've got a, this is like a you're wrong, you're right type of question. When I read as I said, the novel's in two halves. One's in 1986, one's 2017. When I was reading it, it seemed to me that when you were writing the 1986 section, you were almost writing in a style that reflected that time and those lyrics and those records. There was a certain, I don't know, like indie, like it reflected lyrics and times from that time. You seem to be writing, and then when it came to the 2017 section, a little bit of that style was lost, and the style was more composed and more adult, just in the writing. Is that true?
That's absolutely true. You've described it well, and the reason for that, and I think the reason for the technical task there was to make the voicing in the first half true to an 18 to 20-year-old in 1986. That's a piece of not just impersonation, but that's got to be a persuasive being there-ness, if you like. That at 18, you can't know what you're going to be like at 50. You can't have the wisdom that might come later, or indeed the ignorance that might come later. Being 18 is a state of mind that has its own truth and veracity, its own sense. In this novel, there was no internet, there was no knowledge of what was going to happen with technology, and there was no knowledge for these boys of what was going to happen in their own lives, in terms of their working lives or their romantic lives, or nothing. And you've got to preserve that. So you're right, the references and all the way of talking is entirely an artistic attempt to revive and stay true to what was possible then.
Yes.
In the second half, the rules are different because he's 30 years older. The narrator is a professional writer who lives in London, who has had 30 years of experience from the voice that you met in the first half. So the narrative has to reflect that. He's got to suddenly have a new tone. And as you describe it, it might be more mature, it might be more careful. He's lost some of the vim and chaos of his childhood. I mean, they refer back to it because they're still friends. But as I think happens in life, your tone changes as the years go on. And a novel has a responsibility to track that tone. If you don't, the novel will fail. Because if those boys still spoke exactly like it was 1986, then the reader would smell a rat and say, these aren't real people. They don't have blood. They don't have experience. They don't have sadness. Nothing's changed in them. They've been stuck in a groove for 30 years. Now, that's, although you might say that that's possible with people, it's generally not true, and it wasn't true of these boys. Their lives were transformed. Each of them went to an otherness in their lives. They still had umbilical ties to their childhood, and you feel them in the second half.
Yeah.
But what they also have is a new growth. And that, so the job of the writer there in those two halves is to find and establish technically a tone and a voice that's absolutely ripe for that moment. And if it's two styles in the end, then that would seem right to me. You know, there's got to be a difference.
I know, because I mean, when you're just thinking about that, when I read think about it now, like that first chapter, if you would have written that in, you know, the end of 1986 and it somehow got published in 1987, it would feel completely contemporary with what was going on at that time. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. It was where the 2017, if you put that out now, would feel like a contemporary novel if they were sort of cut in two halves. Yeah. I think
that's the job, Robert. The job is to somehow mesh these things,
which you
in
do.
a human way.
Which you do.
And it's a technical risk, actually, to get into it for 5 seconds, you know, to leave a 30-year gap in a novel and allow the reader to fill that gap in their imagination. It's something a novelist can do, just as I think in songwriting sometimes leaving the words out, leaving the over description out allows the listener to create the reality or complete the reality, you might say, in their own imagination. And readers find that very rewarding. Like, I don't tell them what happened over the 30 years. They just know that 30 years have passed and now there's a telephone call. And so they're back into deep dependency and a change in their friendship. What's going to happen, you know? But filling that gap, I mean, movie makers are now interested in the book and they've bought the rights and they're now looking at this problem in a different way because different techniques apply in movies or in television where they're saying, what are we going to do with the 30 years? Are we going to populate it with events and changes and, you know, marriages and children or what? Or are we just going to try and do what the author did and just stop the narrative and pick up?
Yeah, that would seem a sensible thing.
Like that, like novels. I mean, you sometimes meet somebody in the street and 30 years have passed and there's something between your two eyes where you're really trying to account for the loss of time. But of course, you're not going to stand there and fill the gaps. You just sort of assume, oh, I'm now in a new reality with this person.
Yeah.
You feel for the connections.
Is I'm getting back to like the writer's craft. The first section of the book are these 6 lads, and the second half of the book is 2 couples. You know, like both the Jimmy character and the Tully character now have partners that we didn't know in the first. How did you maneuver? Is that part of being able to do a nice split between these two decades? Is obviously, you know, like you've left the boys behind and now you've got 2 long-term sort of relationships that you're writing about. You're down to 4 main characters instead of 6. How do you do that as a writer? Was that like a helpful thing to sort of break, you know, like to write in 2017 and be writing about marriages instead of boyhood?
Well, again, there was an autobiographical guide to this experience in that both Keith, who inspired the book, and myself, we both had partners by then, as people sometimes and very often do after, you know, that passage of time. In the early half, as you say, it's all the boys just being lads together. I mean, they scarcely have a girlfriend between them, which is also sadly slightly autobiographical. But years later, they've all paired up. Most of those boys had married or taken up with long-term partners. So there was an autobiographical guide to that, but also there was a thematic reasoning, which it became kind of almost like Henry James for me, where this relationship between these 2 couples, well, the 2 men in those 2 relationships knew something about each other that their partners didn't know.
Yeah.
And just as in Henry James, you're often facing a kind of blending and dramatizing of clashing consciousnesses.
Yeah.
That's what I saw happening in the second half, is that Tully is very much in love with his partner, who's just about to become his wife in the novel, and equally James with his missus. But there's also, it hasn't killed that relationship between these two men. They still feel they've got a kind of secret between them, and that secret is their childhood and what happened there, and how much they enlarged each other's sense of what life could be. It's not competitive, although they might, some of the characters might see it that way, but it's a kind of, it's part of what you called the maturity of the second half, is that there's other ethical concerns coming in. The manner in which Tully, the character with cancer, will die, the way he's trying to choose to control that end, creates a kind of clash of responsibilities and wishes between his wife and his best friend. And that's part of the drama in the second half of the book. We won't say what happens, but it certainly occurred to me is the right way to go with the book. That was heavily sort of important to me, that the drama of the book should take over. And that, in a sense, the ethical issue of how Tully should die should become an almost largely unspoken, tense drama between these adults. You know, and a novel can do that. You know.
Yeah, but you talked about the two men now have this secret. You know, that there's sort of like electricity between them that their partners who they've met later in life are aware of, but you know, like as you said, there's sort of secrets there. But then a new secret emerges, doesn't it? And that almost sort of throws it back to like a second secret arrives in a way.
I think it's actually exactly as you say. I mean, I think the book is not just about one journey, the journey to Manchester as boys, but two journeys. There's a parallel journey at the end of Tully's life, you know, this journey towards his death. And, you know, the first journey is towards joy and affirmation and belief. And the second is towards the affirmation that is the end. And I think that philosophically, I just wanted them to work very naturally together. I mean, I don't want to offer theories of the novel. What do I know? I just try and do them as well as I can. But one thing I would say is that every part of a novel has to relate to every other part of the novel. Again, to use the analogy that seems natural in this situation, you're trying to write the perfect pop song. Every note relates to every other note. Every phrase relates to every other phrase. There's no slack, there's no unthinking stuff. There's just the pure connectedness of the organism as an art form. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And that's what you're trying for. It's a short novel. Every part of it needs to both relate and suggest and connect to every other part. And for me, that second journey in the book, I mean, ramps up the intensity and indeed the significance of their childhood, because they're relying on that old friendship to see him through to the end. For me, that had innate truth and drama, but also it gives the first half a secondary meaning, if you like. You look back, or at least I did when I finished the novel, I looked back to the first half and said, it wasn't just a summer, you know, glory. It was also, if you like, it was a sadness waiting to happen in the middle of all that joy. And that interests me as a writer, is how what lives amount to and how they build, I suppose, is a question for all novelists, really. And readers connect to that, I think.
Without giving too much away of the plot, the book goes, there's sections in the second half that go to Switzerland, to Zurich, and it also goes to Sicily. And I found this very interesting. I mean, one just very quick thing is that we meet these 5 boys in like poverty Scotland, and the novel ends up in a sort of a chic Zurich restaurant, which is one arc of the book. But another development, if you like, from that sort of Glasgow, Manchester in the 80s, are these trips, 2 trips that the couples make, one to Sicily on a holiday, and the other one at the end of the book to Switzerland, to Zurich. And I'm just wondering, I found this very interesting that suddenly Europe came into the book. And I wonder if there's a coincidence or a link to also around the time the book would have been written and gestating in your head around the time of Brexit as well. If there's anything, if this is just natural to you, or was there a little bit of intent?
You're the only person who spotted this, is that Europe came in very deliberately into the novel, A, because it was true and it had to. I mean, there was an inevitable journey towards, trying to answer that conundrum about how to end Tully's life. Through his eyes, he was obsessed with the notion of having some sort of control, like the control he had when he was young, over his destiny. This is a book about destiny. And the destiny of Britain in Europe, as you rightly indicate, would be a kind of sub-theme in the book, that they have to reach out to a Europe that's receding, and that comes very naturally in that journey. I mean, it's not belabored, there's no argument, they don't discuss Brexit in that way. I mean, there's some comedy about Brexit at one moment in the book, but it's not political in that sense. It's not a topic, if you like, in the book. But novels sometimes become full-blooded because history seeps through the walls of the rooms. That the consciousness in the books don't just exist in some sort of fabricated, disembodied way where they're only thinking about the thing you want them to think about as a writer. You got to be able, the trick is to let them breathe and show how the current times and preoccupations and political realities will seep into their, if not into their conversation, but into their behavior, into their view of the world. And this journey to Europe, at some level, brings in the sense that the Britain that they grew up in is becoming isolated, and that this is a momentous moment of separation for Britain as well as for Tully, the character who's facing his death. So again, you're right to point to, Robert, it's there. I don't want to belabor it because it's not a big feature of the book, but it's certainly there. And sometimes in a novel, you just want to place things into people's consciousness and leave them there.
Yeah. No, I found it.
To bounce in here, but we will have to go to do a reading and then to questions soon. So I'll just let you know. Okay.
Now, no, I mean, just go back for just a second. I found it very natural, and the way it developed, and they went to Sicily, and you think, oh, that's like they live in London, like they're in the UK and they go to Europe. That's very natural, but it's just something that you don't see or read about all that much in novels, or it just came as a surprise to me.
Yeah, I mean, the journeys are natural to them, and these are the kind of trips that they would make, guys like that. Just to touch on something you said, I take a moderator's point about moving on quickly, but just to answer something, I wouldn't describe the boy's childhood as coming from poverty. I mean, I just don't want to give the wrong direction to people. I mean, they grew up in a Britain where people had often lived in public housing, as they still do. They weren't poor necessarily. I mean, our childhoods we grew up in housing estates. Our parents could be a bit chaotic. We didn't have much money, but it was the respectable working class, as it used to be.
Yeah.
No, you're right. The arc is that they become more prosperous themselves and have expectations, perhaps, that their parents wouldn't have had.
Do you want to read a section from the book for us?
Just to give people a flavour of what we've been talking about.
It'd be great.
I'll just do a page or two from the novel. This is just a part in the book where the boys finally get it together. It's the first half of the book. They get it together to go in this legendary, momentous trip to Manchester to see all the bands. And they're in this hall. In time of COVID and lockdown, it probably seems either comforting or too tantalizing to think of a sweaty hall full of teenagers all gripping onto each other and facing the stage and roaring out the song lyrics. But that's the situation we're in here, as they're at Manchester GMEX. The band was at its height, romantic and wronged and fierce and sublime, with haircuts like agendas. Morrissey came brandishing a license, a whole manner of permission, as if a new kind of belonging could be made from feeling left out, like nobody knew you as he did. Time takes nothing away from it. those thousands of heartened teenagers taking the roof off and giving out to a gawky frontman from Stretford. Tully found me and pushed me down to the stage. Over the speakers, the sound was scratchy, but every word and every guitar lick felt like a statement only they could make and only we could hear. Those songs rolling from the stage to irrigate our lives. That's what it's all about, Tully said, shouting, kissing me on the cheek as we sang. I could see Limbo at the very front, whirling out of his skin, holding up a smoke and shouting about panic on the streets of Carlisle. Then he was near us and wagging his finger in time to the music, a wonderful look on his face, singing about a vicar, about Joan of Arc, and throwing plastic tumblers into the air. Our hair was soaking wet. The Ayrshire boys appeared from all corners of the hall, and we hugged and the music soared, and it seemed like a huge animation of the things that mattered to us then. Tibbs and Hogg, Limbo and Tully and Clogs, the full brass of being. Who knew what time incubated or what life would demonstrate? We were there, beyond navigation, floating through the air. We beamed to the rafters and jumped shoulder to shoulder, and the words we sang were daft and romantic and ripe and British, custom built for the clear-eyed young. Thank you.
That was amazing. That was absolutely wonderful.
Fantastic. I could hear the whole book. Have you put out an audio book? Someone's got to get
Yes,
you.
I have. I've recorded it. The producers asked me to, the publishers asked me to record it myself. So I have done, so it's on Audible.
Oh, well, I think that we all, after we've read the book, we probably want to re-listen to it in your voice. But definitely we should buy the physical book first from your independent bookstore. That was absolutely insightful and a fantastic conversation between the two of you. Robert, your questions were so interesting. I think taking really interesting lines into a book and teasing out some more about them. And thank you, Andrew, for your answers. We have some more questions here from the audience though. So if it's okay, I'll ask you.
Absolutely.
So Christina has asked, why fiction if there's so much autobiographical content in here? Did you think about writing it as memoir at all?
Do you know, one of the interesting things about writing professionally is that the stories often arrive with a kind of label on them in your head. I'm a fan of memoir, and I write non-fiction for the London Review of Books, you know, all year. I mean, I'm a great aficionado of literary non-fiction, and I would have done this as a memoir had it come with that label on it, and it's in my head, but it didn't. It came as a novel from the beginning, and I'll tell you why I think that is. That despite its closeness to a lot of the parts of my lived experience and my friendship and so on, and my growing up, I wanted to have certain liberties with the story. I wanted it to go in its own way. The internal rows of the story in the novel were already apparent to me. And with a memoir, I mean, I'm quite old-fashioned about non-fiction in the sense that I want it to be able to stand up in court, as it were. You know, I'm an old-style reporter in that way. I'd want to have everything checked twice, that and the multi-perspectives that you need to pay attention to in non-fiction. You know, all the other people in Keith's lives would need to have their truth reflected properly and, as it were, legally. And that just wasn't the kind of book it was. I mean, I will write memoirs someday, and including about some aspects of my childhood, but this book came as Mayflies, where the internal rhythm and the internal sort of connections in the book were connected with sort of fictional tissue, if you'll allow me that. It just had to be a novel. Wonderful.
Well, we're very glad that you wrote it as a novel. And Fiona Stager, who's the owner of Avid Reader, is also very glad you wrote it as a novel because she says it's one of her favourite books this year that she's read. And she wants to know if the two main characters play a game which explains historical events, how historical events occur, like Fred Astaire caused Brexit. And where did this kind of idea come from?
Well, there are all these absurd sort of riffs and rants that Robert referred to, the sort of quickness of this dialogue. And, you know, part of the joy of writing the book, and that's a word I don't often use, I have to warn you, in relation to the graft of trying to, you're often hauling it out of the dark, you know, but there was a kind of fun almost for me in writing Mayflies. Now, overwhelmed by the reaction to it because people feel the fun in it. They also increasingly feel the pull of a sadness too. But those riffs were really based on a kind of exaggerated version of what my pals used to do in life and still do. If we were all together in the pub tonight, I mean, they would take an absurd notion, you know, about who invented Brexit, trace it back through a lot of unlikely connections to somehow to Fred Astaire, or that a certain movie had caused a sort of change in the whole culture of Australia. You know, they had this kind of butterfly notion effect that if, you know, somebody dropped their pint in a Glasgow pub, then the ructions could be felt in Samoa, you know, and that kind of comedy, full of the particularity of their own language and style, but also the references to pop culture and so on. That's what inspired me to write those passages in the book. I just got really into the rhythm of those absurd stories, and would laugh myself as they felt like a gift from my old pals. You know, those parts of the book. I mean, sometimes I'd phone one of them up. There's a friend, Peter Padden, who works for the Postal Service in Britain. He's a great storyteller, and sometimes I would text him and say, can you just tell me about certain aspects of, you know, Scottish football? Just lay it out for me. That comes from the past, from my pals, and from a sense of that kind of absurd exuberance.
That's fantastic. Look, there's a question here from Andy, who says that the review suggests that everyone has a Tully, the friend who defines your life. And I mean, obviously, possibly your Tully is not there to read this book, but are there other friends that now define your life who've read this book, and what do they think about that?
You know, one of the pieces of luck, and it is real luck and fortune that can come to a writer who's written out of not just his or her life, but out of many lives, is that the people who gave you those hints and those experiences and sparked the characters support the book when it's published. And I've had wall-to-wall support and, you know, identification. You know, the boys who were on that trip to Manchester with me many years ago, and he used to go with me to see Robert's band, and just, you know, whole nights, weeks, months built around those shared adorations, they all have come behind the book in an incredible way. I mean, I've had letters, emails, texts from people from my past like I never expected to see. Because of course it's many years ago now, and they see the license that I've taken, where I've taken license, they see the differences, they see what I've added onto characters, but they essentially believe that I've preserved something of their lives as well as mine, is now a permanent fixture on the bookshelves.
Great. And Vanessa asks about the music of today. So what are you listening to now? And does this music of today resonate with you in any way?
Well, you know, I think if you like music, you never stop listening to it, you know, and you never stop getting excited by the idea of a new band. I was listening to the new album that's behind me on the record player there, Fontaine DC, an Irish band out of Dublin, just really, really full of a lot of that energy and sort of singular voicedness that we loved in the bands that we loved. A kind of surprising irony creeps into the lyrics in the way that those indie bands that we really loved, taking a band like Orange Juice, fronted by Edwyn Collins, they were part of a generation of bands that used to be advertised as the sound of young Scotland, the Fire Engines, Aztec Camera, Orange Juice, bands that we loved. And they had a kind of irony and sweetness and this incredible sort of riot about them. And so when I hear that in a band now, I dive straight onto them. I buy the album the same day if I ever get hints of that. So and there's a lot of dance music that came after that period. We got into dance music later on, and a lot of soul music. So that's all stuff that I'll still look for.
Mm. And there's a question here about the balance between the humour in the book and the sadness in the book. And was that a bit of a dance for you to try and get that balanced and right?
A dance is right. I mean, it's exactly the right image. You know, it was like sometimes like dancing on a high wire strapped between two crumbling buildings, you know, to make sure that the book's joy and exuberance didn't wipe out the sadness and the pathos, and equally that the tragedy in the book didn't sort of blanket out that childhood. So preserving the roundedness of the lives, that they did go from one place to another. There's a journey from innocence to experience and back in the book. William Blake's sort of definition of the roundedness of life in terms of innocence and experience, I wanted that for the book, and so I had to do that dance constantly to stop the book being nostalgic or you know, too much pathos in the wrong way. You know, it just had to have the breath of life.
That's fantastic. I think you've done it amazingly well, and hopefully there's another book on the way, because I see behind you that you have the workings of something in progress.
Yeah, mood board for the next book. I mean, that's only part of it, but this is, I mean, I think I've had what I've described as the fun of writing Mayflies, and it's been lovely publishing it and seeing the response. But for writers, it's always nose back to the grindstone, invent another world, populate it with people who might or might not exist. But for me, the value in it and the sort of reward of it is this: the connection with the readers, going to the independent booksellers, supporting the effort to get ideas and a bit of breathed life into your books and out to the public. That's what it's all about for me.
Fantastic. Well, look, that's probably a note to end the evening on. And for people who do want to get a sense of this book in a deeper way, you can click on that link that I shared with you, which will take you to the Avid Reader website. And if you use the word event, E-V-E-N-T, you can get a 10% discount, not just on Mayflies, but on any other book that you put in your cart. And perhaps you want to put a Robert Forster book in your cart as well.
Could you give me 10 seconds just to say before we go that I really want to express my thanks to all of you. I know these are strange times. We're locked down. We're having to do it, as it were, even longer distance than normal. But I want to say thank you to you. And a special thanks to Robert Forster. He's a hero of mine. He has been for a long time. And to a lot of the boys who inspired this book, he's a great figure, a wonderful man. And thank you for taking the trouble to come out tonight and speak to me.
Well, thank you for the book, Andrew. It's I gobbled it. It was like three goes, day in bed. Fantastic.
Fantastic. Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Andrew. And look, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to allow the readers to thank you with a clap, because I'm going to allow them to unmute themselves. So if people can lean over and click unclick, we can clap. Like you're in real life.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
Andrew, thank you, Robert. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
I loved it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, and goodbye. Goodbye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. That was
Bye,
wonderful.
Bye.
Good night. Good night, everybody.